It is Tuesday, February 6th, 2018, and this is 3000 NFL Mock Draft for myself, Kenneth Arthur, and co-host Rob Staten from SeahawksDraftBlog.com, myself at FieldGoals.com. We get together every so often, maybe once a week, maybe once every month, to talk about the NFL draft. And man, this is officially free agent season, so not draft season, but it is pretty much draft season. The NFL scouting combine coming up soon, as teams, after they sign their free agents and see their needs of terms of players that they lose and what they'll need to fill in, that'll come through the draft. And we're going to talk about the draft here today in our third segment of 3000 NFL Mock Draft. We'll also be talking about the Seattle Seahawks, of course, and we will get into that here shortly in terms of where they're at, where they stand, new coaches, what players they may, sort of let go of and which ones they may target. But first, we want to open up with, because it is 2 days, it might be Tuesday here where I'm sitting, but it is 2 days after the Super Bowl. The Philadelphia Eagles pull off the upset 41-33 over the New England Patriots to win the 2017 NFL sort of championship season. That is the Philadelphia Eagles. Surprising to me for sure. Although I think going into the game, I kind of had, I was telling people Eagles, but I didn't feel great about it. But I felt that the Eagles, the Patriots defense was so bad. But we'll get into that. And we'll get into some other things. But the Eagles are the champions. Not only was it surprising, even when they were, 10-2 after their loss to the Seahawks, they had Carson Wentz, even all that stuff. I thought the Eagles, did they have enough? Were they a championship team? Were they a year or two away? I think I would have said a year or two away. And then when Carson Wentz goes down, you would think, well, they're definitely at least a year away. But Nick Foles comes through in the playoffs, one of the best postseason performances statistically by a quarterback ever in the playoffs. And now the Eagles are blessed, not with just the fact that they've already won a ring, but they know that they have two quarterbacks that they probably feel comfortable going with, and one of which, probably Nick Foles, will be able to be traded for a pretty good price tag, especially given what he cost and where he was at even a month ago in the season finale. Rob, you've seen Nick Foles in college. You've seen Nick Foles prepare for the 2012 draft. We've seen Nick Foles get drafted a little bit after Russell Wilson. Now both are Super Bowl champions. You've seen Nick Foles with the Rams. You've seen him under Chip Kelly, and you've seen him under Doug Peterson. Where do you see Nick Foles today? What's his value out there? Where does he fit maybe on a team? And what kind of a player do you think they'd be getting?
Well, I can't imagine his value is particularly, even though he's won the Super Bowl MVP, I can't imagine there's going to be, a red hot market for him, because really you've got to look back to where he came from, which was a bit of a failure in Los Angeles and in St. Louis. And then maybe people could say that's because that was the team that, they just look what happened under Jeff Fisher. And then a bit of a spells, I think it was a backup in Kansas City. And I think really it's credit to Doug Peterson, really, in getting him in a position where he could help them win. The first few games that he started, he seemed to just be there to almost not lose them the games, to keep things ticking along, to try and point guard the situation. Then you see him in the Super Bowl, played a really strong game. So I think credit to him for that. Credit to the coaching staff for putting him in a position to be a winner like that. Great story. I think it's an NFL season that ultimately deserved to have someone like Nick Foles being the Super Bowl MVP, because it wasn't a particularly great year. And we see what happens now. If a team is going to be moved to now spend a first or a second round pick, for example, trading for Nick Foles, then I think you just have to doff your cap to the Philadelphia Eagles for the way they've managed to do that with Sam Bradford and with Nick Foles now. But I would be a little bit surprised if somebody does that. However, having said that, there are teams that need quarterbacks, whether it's Cleveland, whether it's Denver, whether it's the New York Jets, Arizona. So there are certainly plenty of teams out there who may feel if they can't get to one of the top rookie quarterbacks, if they can't get to Kirk Cousins, that maybe Nick Foles and Case Keenum and players like that could be an option for them.
So with that, being said, on the other side of the ball, you've got the New England Patriots, and Tom Brady, has one of the biggest games in Super Bowl history, over 500 yards. And even then, like in the playoffs, 8 touchdowns, no interceptions, 8.1 yards per attempt. This was his best postseason by those marks ever. And he's also 40 years old. Obviously, the Patriots probably at this point feel very good about their decision to get what they could from Jimmy Garoppolo and feeling confident about Tom Brady for next season. Do you feel, confident for Tom Brady? What would be your long-term outlook, not just on Brady, but was there anything here with the Patriots loss that made you think maybe this is the end?
I don't think there was anything in this game that made me think this is the end, because they're still playing the AFC East, and the AFC East is going to keep New England relevant for a few more years yet. I think one thing I learned from this Super Bowl more than anything, and Tom Brady, I still think he looked terrific, and certainly it was the defense for New England that cost them the game. I think what I learned from this Super Bowl more than anything is that we can be a little bit reactionary sometimes. So at the moment, we're all talking about the way that Philadelphia won and how you have to copy Philadelphia if you want to sort of do what they've done and win a Super Bowl, or the way that New England and Philadelphia essentially pass the ball, or the way they set up their offenses, or the way just the style of this particular game. And yet it's not that long ago that people were saying you had to have a great defense to win the title. So look at the Seahawks, for example. Look at the way that Denver won a Super Bowl practically playing without a quarterback in that game, because Peyton Manning did absolutely nothing against the Panthers. It was the defense that won them the game, and that was the dynamic there, that you needed this great defense. And then it just constantly switches and flips and moves around, and it's a very trendy league. So whatever happened in the last Super Bowl tends to be the way that teams will mimic and copy things now. I think in terms of the Seahawks, for example, I know we're going to come on to this in a second. I'm hoping not jumping the gun a little bit, but I don't think they will actually take that much from this game and say, this is what we need to do. We need to copy the Eagles. We need to copy the Patriots or whatever. I think what they will do is they will continue with their tried and tested formula Pete Carroll trusts in and believes in, and they're going to do their own thing. But in terms of what learning the game about New England, I think that they'll be back next year. Whether or not they can win another championship, that was probably going to depend on whether they can restock that defense, because defensively they did not play very well at all. And the stats prove that. I mean, in terms of yardage during the year, they were very disappointing. They've made some big moves during the offseason to bring in people like Gilmore, the cornerback, and one or two other moves, but they've lost key players. The Chandler Jones trade looks like an absolute disaster with hindsight. How badly could they do with him? Their defensive pass rush is tepid at best. They need to bring in some players. They need to draft, and they need to sign some better defensive players.
Well, I personally, I wrote an article this week on Field Goals on Monday called "What Can We Learn from the 2017 Eagles?" And I think from that dive into copycatting and what people take away from Super Bowl champions is, I don't think that and I agree, I don't think there is much to be learned from the 2017 Eagles. I think that they ultimately should go down as one of the more mediocre teams to win the Super Bowl. That is not to say that they are mediocre. That is just to say that when you lay out all 52 Super Bowl champions, I think the 2017 Philadelphia Eagles may end up falling in the bottom 10 or 20. Not that they're a bad team. They're just, you look at the path that they got to get there. The Cowboys imploded and were without Ezekiel Elliott for 6 games. The Giants were terrible. Washington was average to below average, so the division itself wasn't that challenging. Their regular season schedule included 3 games against playoff teams. They lost to the Seahawks 24-10. And then their path to the Super Bowl was, it was basically securing that number 1 seed in the NFC. And only needing 13-3 to do it, which is still usually the best record, but still getting the NFC, getting that home field advantage, meaning that they host the Atlanta Falcons, who are not as dangerous as they were a year ago. And then coming in, you get Minnesota, you get Case Keenum, and then you get the New England Patriots, one of the worst defenses to ever walk into a Super Bowl. I would say that if there was anything to be learned, it's hope that you get lucky on your schedule. And the Eagles deserve every second of this championship, no taking anything away from them. But in terms of what to take away from them, in terms of how to build a team, I agree. I don't think that there is much, and they still have a lot of work to do to get back to the Super Bowl for next year. I know a lot of people have highlighted the ones on this team who are locked in through 2019. We heard the same story with the Seattle Seahawks, how their players were young and they were locked in through, 3-4 years down the line. No doubt that the Eagles are in a good position with Carson Wentz, just like Russell Wilson, winning a Super Bowl in his second season, having a coach who's, going to have, a lot of runway ahead of him and feeling decent about it. But their running backs were not that exciting. They ended up getting the job done. It's interesting. And I could see the Eagles maybe not making the playoffs next year, just given so many other factors. But Rob, in terms of what you do like about the Eagles, who are the players, or what were the decisions that made you think like that was smart, or that was the player that if you can go out, if you're the Seahawks and you get yourself a Brandon Graham or something like that, that'll change a team. What would be the thing from the Eagles that you think is the most important?
Well, I think you touched on a couple of really good points there. The first of what I want to address is that you're absolutely right that essentially if you get the number one seed in the NFC, it gives you a really good chance to get to the Super Bowl. I know that Dallas didn't do it a year ago, but Atlanta were the number 2 seed. Dallas blew it, so Atlanta essentially became the de facto number 1 and won in the NFC Championship game. So that has to be, if the Seahawks want to get back to the Super Bowl, they've never been to a Super Bowl when they haven't been the number 1 seed. That's what they've got to aim for. In terms of what I like about Philadelphia, I think it's the fact that they're a team more than anything else. Maybe one thing the Seahawks lack now, or have lacked the last couple of years that they didn't that they had previously, is that this was a young, hungry group that did not have, the best paid players on the team. For example, were people like Red Bryant, or it was Brandon Mebane, or it was Sidney Rice or Zach Miller. Veteran players who had come in either before the regime took over, the Carroll regime, or had been inherited since in free agency and had kind of proven a little bit in the league. And you had the people like your Chancellors and your Shermans and your Earl Thomases and Russell Wilsons. They'd not had that second contract yet. And what you had was this real young, hungry chemistry. And as time has gone on and all of those players have been paid, what you ended up having was an all-star team. And you had players who maybe even had third contracts, and you've got players that were incredibly rich. And I think one thing we've maybe learned the last 2 years is that it's really hard to stay at the top when you've got that. And I look at the Eagles, and this is a team that, Chip Kelly blew it up, and then Roseman's come back in, and he's completely changed everything and like churned and got this young, hungry group, this young quarterback who they're not paying loads of money to yet. They've got young players. They've brought players in that they've just, there's players with a point to prove there. And if you were to sort of pick out who were the absolute stars on that Philadelphia team, it's kind of hard to do, because you would say, well, Carson Wentz is injured, so you're not saying the quarterback. They've got a stable of running backs. They haven't just got one. The offensive line's missing Jason Peters, so they haven't got him. There's a few receivers there that you like. I guess Alshon Jeffrey's okay, but nothing really stands out there. Good defensive line, good pass rush, like Fletcher Cox, but again, there's not like 5 or 6 guys there being paid mega bucks. Linebackers are fine. Secondary's fine. It's as a group, there's not really anything that stands out. And then when you look at the Seahawks, you say, well, they've got Richard Sherman, and they've got Earl Thomas, and they've got Cam Chancellor, and they've got Russell Wilson, and they've got Boy Wagner, and they've got this, and they've got that, and they've got Jimmy Graham. All of these players that have been paid. And maybe, I don't know whether it's that Philadelphia's got a better middle class as a consequence of that, because they're not paying all these players top money. I don't know whether it's because they're younger, or maybe they've got something to prove. I don't know what it is, but it just seems to be that difference there. Maybe the Seahawks need to stop being an all-star team, and they need to clean house a little bit, churn, become younger, become more hungry, get that chip back on the shoulder within the bulk of that roster, and try and go again, because that seems to be the big difference. And we'll learn from Philadelphia, because next year Philadelphia are going to have paid players, and in a couple of years they'll have paid players, and they'll have already won a Super Bowl. They'll have already achieved that lifetime ambition, and we'll see how they respond to this. And it wouldn't be a total shock if they were 7-9 again next year, because they've actually got to the pinnacle now. What left is there for a lot of these guys? apart from going and doing it again, which maybe they will, but it's very difficult to do. So I think that's the one thing that would learn from this.
Yeah. And, before we get into the Seahawks, just getting a better picture of the NFL around the Seahawks as of today, the Washington team has traded for Alex Smith, signed him to a 4-year, $94 million contract to be their next quarterback. The trade of Alex Smith, how it changes the quarterback carousel is that it puts Pat Mahomes into a starting role for the Kansas City Chiefs immediately, and it makes Kirk Cousins a likely free agent in March, making him the biggest free agent since Peyton Manning in 2013, and then prior to that, Drew Brees in 2006. So this is a monumental move for Washington after 2 years of the franchise tag, deciding, look, we just don't think we can commit to you. We've seen enough. I felt that way as well, that I wouldn't want to commit to Kirk Cousins, though the commitment to Alex Smith is just as mind-boggling to me. I think that Alex Smith, if anything, I get he'll elevate you to a certain level, but I think it also almost guarantees that you probably won't win the Super Bowl anyway. That being said, Kirk Cousins becoming available, it means that Alex Smith is not going to Arizona, and a Cardinals thing seemed like it would make some sense, but Kirk Cousins, is available. He's not being linked to Arizona a ton. Their new head coach is Steve Wilkes, the former defensive coordinator for the Carolina Panthers. But Rob, what do you think of Pat Mahomes with Kansas City, Alex Smith with Washington, and the free agency of Kirk Cousins?
I think it's slightly fascinating. Mahomes at Kansas City, seems to have a lot of potential, a lot of excitement about him. Kansas City made a big move for him, so it'll be fun to see how he does as a starter next year. In terms of Alex Smith, I know that the trade got a lot of hammer. A lot of people didn't like that trade. I don't think it's quite as bad as people have made out. Yes, you lose a good young cornerback, but you also set yourself up to have at least 2-3 years of steady quarterback play with Alex Smith, and it enables you to transition to a younger quarterback in the same way that Kansas City have done. So Washington will now have an opportunity over the next couple of years to draft a younger quarterback, develop them under Alex Smith, and be ready for that transition. Alex Smith's he will keep Washington competitive. And as we saw last year, I traveled all the way to Seattle to watch Washington beat Seattle. So they are a competitive team. So I think that it's a fair deal. And you don't want to be paying Kirk Cousins like $30 million a year anyway, in terms of what it would have been if they'd have franchised him again or whatever. And I don't think a long-term deal was coming. So essentially they've covered their arse there by bringing him in. The Kirk Cousins one's interesting because he seems to be linked an awful lot to Minnesota. And I find the Vikings a really sort of fascinating team in all of this, because if a year ago you would have said, right, the Vikings are going to have Sam Bradford, Teddy Bridgewater, and Case Keenum as their quarterbacks, you would kind of go, ugh, and shudder at the prospect of such a bang average group of quarterbacks potentially leading your team. And yet they might be able to trade now Sam Bradford for a decent pick. They spent a first rounder on him. I doubt they get that, but they might be able to trade him for a reasonably high pick. They might be able to trade Teddy Bridgewater for a decent pick. And given that he was on the brink of retirement not so long ago, that would be a win for them. And if Case Keenum leaves in free agency and signs a big deal somewhere else, even if it's only a 1-year deal, they might get a 3rd-round comp pick for Case Keenum, who they just brought off the street to be the number 3 in training camp. So what a situation that would be, where you would turn a really average-looking group of quarterbacks into some decent draft stock, and then be in a position to go and sign Kirk Cousins as your franchise quarterback. And listen, with the defense that they've got there and the setup that they have in Minnesota, Kirk Cousins could be enough to push Minnesota over the top.
Yeah, that would be interesting. And it also means that if Kirk Cousins, that keeps pushing it along, if Kirk Cousins goes to Minnesota, what becomes of Case Keenum? And the Minnesota Vikings at 13-3 were right there with the number 1 seed. They were that close to maybe hosting the Eagles in the NFC Championship. So it's interesting with the NFC. If we were wrapping up the NFC East, if you've got Carson Wentz in Philadelphia and they're the defending world champions, if the Dallas Cowboys, who were the number 1 seed a year ago, they've got Dak Prescott, Washington's at Alex Smith, and the Giants at the number 2 seed. Who's the quarterback for the Giants next year, and who do you see winning the NFC East? Assuming it's Philadelphia, maybe, but That team hasn't repeated as NFC East champ since 2004. So it's been an interesting little switcheroo every single year. What do you see as the Giants quarterback under Pat Shurmur, and who do you see winning the division?
Giants are going to be an interesting team because the Dave Gettleman, the GM, seemed to suggest that he was backing Eli Manning. And the only reason why I put a lot of faith into that is that I think that Eli has enough respect in that building, and they messed him around too much at the end of last year, that if they were legitimately preparing to move on from him, then or draft someone, for example, at number 2 and put him under a lot of pressure, then I think they would just be a little bit more honest about that situation. The way that Gettleman was talking almost seemed to suggest that they believe that Eli Manning could play for another couple of years. So I don't know. I mean, they I suppose when they drafted Eli, they drafted somebody else, and they drafted Eli and had him sit initially, and then he became the starter. So I guess that could happen again. And they may see this as that rare opportunity to draft a quarterback early and feel secure with that. So I could easily imagine Sam Darnold, if he's there at number 2, or Josh Rosen, or Josh Allen, or even Baker Mayfield being an option there. I do think that they are going to be tempted, though, to have a situation where, and this could make them instantly competitive as well, because, I mean, they have some players on defense. They've got Odell Beckham. Thought Evan Engram had a really good rookie year. It seems like Gettleman's going to spend a lot of free agency money on Norwell at Carolina, the guard, to try and bring him in. And practically, some of the reports I was reading, he was going to open just a checkbook and write a blank check for Norwell, the guard, Andrew Norwell. So if he's able to repair the O-line in free agency and then gets to number 2 and Saquon Barkley's there, he might feel like an offense with Eli controlling things, being that veteran, with Odell Beckham outside, Evan Engram as your tight end, and Saquon Barkley in your backfield, that might be so explosive that it's going to be very, very difficult to stop. And if they can get what they got it from 2016 out of the defense, then they could be easily the NFC East champions. I suppose I can really sort of see Philadelphia coming back down to earth a little bit. So if you want to talk about the NFC East, I guess it's very, very early, but I suppose Dallas and the Giants are good enough to have a bounce back year. So I could easily see those two competing for the title next year.
Well, let me put the challenge to you again with the NFC North. First being, you touched on the Minnesota Vikings and their quarterback situation, and all 3 of their quarterbacks are free agents. So where do you see Case Keenum, Sam Bradford, and Teddy Bridgewater respectively ending up? And the NFC North itself is interesting. The Chicago Bears have Matt Nagy as a new head coach and Mitch Trubisky going into his second year. The Green Bay Packers went 7-9, and they'll be getting Aaron Rodgers back, I believe. And the Detroit Lions at 9-7, they've got Matt Patricia as their new head coach, and promising maybe, but also the Lions. So where do you see the 3 Minnesota Viking quarterbacks winding up as starters? And who do you think wins the NFC North?
Hard to say, really, because I think if Pat Shurmur had gone to Arizona, you could easily link Case Keenum to that. I think that could be a relationship that continues, but it seems very unlikely that he would go to New York with Shurmur. I think what we may well see is just this like frantic, mad rush for quarterbacks that ends up getting a bit crazy in free agency. So I can imagine Denver and Minnesota and maybe a surprise team really, really pushing for Kirk Cousins. I think Arizona is probably going to be a bit too cheap for Kirk Cousins. And then you may well see teams falling over themselves to try and get at Sam Bradford. Maybe there's a team that thinks, I'm not convinced on Case Keenum, and we're not going to be able to go in for Kirk Cousins, so let's throw all our eggs in Sam Bradford basket and let's see if we can get him and he can be a steady starter for us if you can trust his medical. So maybe they can find a deal with Minnesota and get him in. And I think teams will do this and still be prepared to go and then draft a quarterback. It's kind of just a hedge. And the Seahawks did it with Matt Flynn. When they signed Matt Flynn to big money, they still went and drafted Russell Wilson and ended up starting him. So, for example, a team like Denver, for example, might throw some money the way or a draft pick the way for Sam Bradford or for Case Keenum and still fully intend to draft a quarterback at number 5. It just sort of gives them that insurance. So hard to predict where the players will end up. I mean, I could imagine Arizona getting a little bit desperate and maybe bringing in Sam Bradford or Case Keenum Teddy Bridgewater, I'm not sure. I'm really not sure what his with him and Bradford. It's going to come down to the medical situation and how much you trust them. But if teams are confident on the medicals with Teddy Bridgewater, he's still young enough to sort of think, well, give him a shot and still draft somebody maybe to compete with him. Very hard to predict, and I think that generally the NFC North, I can imagine Minnesota being really competitive if they do get Kirk Cousins and possibly taking that crown away from Green Bay. But whatever Green Bay have got Aaron Rodgers, they're going to be the team to beat.
I have to agree. And I just also just as interesting as going over the NFC, it is so heavily tilted. The quarterbacks in the NFC are so heavily tilted towards that way compared to the AFC. It's insane. And we might see a dominant performance by the NFC for quite some time. You know how these things come in chunks where one conference will dominate the other. When you look at it, the worst quarterback in the NFC might be whoever plays for Arizona, which at this point, could be Kirk Cousins. There are good options available out there, unlike most seasons. Could be whoever plays for Arizona, Jameis Winston, a number 1 pick, Mitch Trubisky, a number 2 pick, and then Eli Manning. I mean, that's the worst. And in the AFC, you've got Brady, who's going to be turning 41, Ben Roethlisberger, who's going to be 38 or something, Andrew Luck, who has not played in a year and a half or whatever, and Phillip Rivers. And then you get into the Derek Carr, Pat Mahomes, Deshaun Watson, stuff like that. It's so heavily tilted towards the NFC. And this draft, with the Giants picking at 2, there are options here for the NFC to even get stronger. If Alex Smith goes to Washington and that pushes Kirk Cousins to Minnesota and that pushes Case Keenum to whatever, Arizona or whatever, I mean, what a stronger NFC is than the AFC right now. Do you see that? Do you see what I'm seeing in terms of how heavily tilted the NFC is? How does the AFC, this would seem to be their opportunity now for Cleveland to get a quarterback, for the Bills in your latest draft, you have them getting a quarterback. This is an opportunity for some of these, Denver, New York. They need to do something. Do you see any opportunity here or do you see the NFC just? It looks like things are going the NFC's way right now.
Yeah, it does. And the NFC really should have won the Super Bowl last year as well. I mean, Atlanta completely blew that. So really, they should have won the last 2 Super Bowls. We could even go back as far as the Seahawks and say they should have won theirs. And then you're talking about Denver being the only AFC team to win the Super Bowl in quite a long time. So I think that there's a real strength in the NFC, and it's a shame because it does mean that it's quite easy for the New England Patriots. And no one would ever take anything away from the Patriots. Obviously, they've had this great dynasty. They've had a great run. They've won 5 championships. You have to praise them for that. No one's ever going to say that Belichick and Brady aren't anything but fantastic and possibly the greatest coach and quarterback ever to play the game. No one would ever deny that. But when you're playing 6 games against the AFC East and you're playing 4 games against another AFC opponent every single year, that's an advantage. It just is. And when the Seahawks have had this great run under Pete Carroll and John Schneider, for example, they've always had to, and this is just one division, they've always had to compete with either a really strong Bruce Arians-led Arizona Cardinals, or they've had to fight against the Harbaugh 49ers, or they've had Jeff Fisher just sticking around and just being a pain in the arse in the NFC West, even if his team were hopeless against every other opponent. And now you've got McVay and the Rams coming up on the rear and having a really strong year and winning the division this year. So, that kind of level of competition, it's not as thick throughout the AFC. And I suppose you could say at times the AFC West has been quite competitive, especially as Oakland have got their act together until last year. And apart from that, it's been fairly weak. And it's why sort of teams like Pittsburgh and New England seem to be so competitive, even though they have weaknesses in their team. Like, let's not mess around here. New England have got some really good players on offense, but defensively, there are serious question marks there. When you watch Pittsburgh, at no point during the season did you watch, I personally didn't feel like you watched Pittsburgh, for example, and think, wow, what a fantastic balanced team. And then you sort of saw Jacksonville, and you couldn't help but be impressed with what they were doing on defense and the way they were running the ball. But they still have Blake Bortles as their quarterback. And you kind of think, well, they've got a weakness there. The quarterback, if they had a better quarterback, then they would be a real legitimate contender. But they've got that major weakness. And I think that's what the AFC is all about. It's it's a conference full of teams with flaws, whereas the NFC seems to have teams that are a lot more balanced. There's better quarterbacks overall. I mean, there's obviously Brady's in the AFC, but you've got better quarterbacks overall, and it is a better conference at the moment, and I think that will continue next year.
So if we were just quickly, and again, as you already mentioned, that this is way early, but if we were looking ahead to the NFC South, very interesting division. Saints 11-5, Panthers 11-5, Falcons 10-6. So very tightly compacted. All three went to the playoffs. The Saints seem to be a very balanced team, but Drew Brees is on the older side right now. Carolina, also balanced, but I don't think Cam Newton is the one. I think he would fall in the latter half of the quality of quarterbacks in the NFC. And then Atlanta, so inconsistent, week to week, year to year, trying to figure themselves out, knowing which Matt Ryan is going to show up, all these sorts of things. And then the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who I thought looked like a playoff team going into last season, but then just played like real crap and were much worse than you thought they should be given the talent there. But the Bucs perhaps at least have an opportunity again here at pick 7 to maybe get another good player and perhaps turn things around right away. So when you're looking at the NFC South, and I guess Drew Brees is technically a free agent unless I'm mistaken. And we've seen the Falcons and the Panthers with their whole thing with Christian McCaffrey. I don't know, we can get into it, but NFC South, who do you like the most as of this February?
I think that of all the teams, you'd probably be leaning towards New Orleans at the moment, and they should have been in the NFC Championship. Who knows? I mean, like, if you're a Saints fan right now, you must be pretty agitated because there's no way you should have lost that game in Minnesota. I'm not convinced the Saints go to Philadelphia and roll over in the way that Minnesota did, not with Drew Brees in there in that running game. So they've got a lot of young talent on defense. The one thing that always held New Orleans back was an absolutely pathetic, abject defense. And that's no longer the case. They've got young studs there in Lattimore and some of the other players that they drafted recently. They've still got Cam Jordan. Sheldon Rankins is healthy again. They will have an opportunity to further draft and bolster that defense and get it really rocking. They've invested a lot in their offensive line. They've still got Ingram. They've still got Kamara. And I fully expect Drew Brees to be back with New Orleans. It makes too much sense for both the player and the team. They've just got to get to the number now. So I think that they for me would be the team, and like you say, it's still very, very early, but I think they will be the team to beat as things stand going into the NFC South next year.
Finally, in this, we'll transition to us into talking about the Seahawks in the NFC West. The Rams, of course, win that division and then did nothing in the playoffs. And I think I can hold that as a boast over their heads for as long as at least another year because the Seahawks, every time they won the NFC West from 2010 to 2016, or every time they made the playoffs, they at least won a game. And the Rams went 11-5. They couldn't win a game. They couldn't represent the NFC West. The Rams are garbage. Jared Goff is overrated. All right, I got that out of my system. Outside of the Seahawks and the Rams, between the Arizona Cardinals and the San Francisco 49ers, you've got a new head coach in Arizona, and they need to find a new quarterback. San Francisco, probably a much weaker roster top to bottom, but they feel like they've got their quarterback in Jimmy Garoppolo, and they won their last 5 games, and they've got Kyle Shanahan, whatever he wants to do. They're a year ahead of whatever Arizona is going to be doing in terms of implementing a new system with new coaches and getting everyone on the same page. San Francisco, Arizona, which of those two teams do you think, if you had to pick one, would be most likely to win the NFC West?
I think San Francisco, without any shadow of a doubt. I think that Arizona are going to really regress now. I mean, they've got a terrible-looking quarterback situation. They may need to be really aggressive in the draft to go up and get a quarterback. It's still not clear whether Larry Fitzgerald's going to come back. Their defense has really missed Calais Campbell. They've still got some strength on defense, but I don't know. And the offense is just a real concern. And now they haven't got Bruce Arians either. I mean, the one thing is that Bruce Arians, as much as Seahawks fans probably didn't quite like his manner and some of the things that he said before and after they played the Seahawks, he could clearly coach an offense and could coach them to be productive. So they've lost all of that. They've got a defensive-minded head coach now. It'll be interesting to see how they set their offense up and who they go with. I think that Arizona's got a really strong case to be picking in the top 10 in the draft next year, as opposed to challenging for the NFC West. And the 49ers are on the up. You know, they had a good first draft last year. They have got over $100 million in cap room, so they'll have no problem keeping Jimmy Garoppolo and adding a few other pieces as well. They pick high, they could trade down, and they've got so much draft stock. Even though they traded the second-round pick for Garoppolo, they've still got another second-round pick. I think it's from New Orleans, who traded up to get Alvin Kamara a year ago. So they've got plenty of draft stock there. And I think this is one of the reasons why the Seahawks are going to try and be quite bold and aggressive themselves this offseason and try and change the roster. I think the Seahawks anticipate that what could happen next season is that the Rams continue to improve and develop under Sean McVay, and the 49ers are going to be a young, hungry, upcoming team that are going to be really good. And I don't think the Seahawks want to be the aging team who the other teams get to turn up and beat and say, we've arrived and we're the cream of the crop now. I think the Seahawks almost are resigned to the fact they're going to take a step back to take 2 steps forward. And if they want to try and compete with San Francisco and the Rams, not just in 2018, but in 19, 20, 21, then they're going to have to do a little bit of what they're doing, which is getting younger, which is getting new, which is getting fresh, which is getting talent and starting over a little bit again. And if the Seahawks do that now, it may not mean that they win a title in 2018, but they might be right back up there in 1920. And they've still got Russell Wilson, so they'll still be competitive in 2018. But they may be doing what they need to do now in order to be really strong for the years ahead, as opposed to just being somewhat competitive again in 2018.
Right. And I think it is a good point to be made that the Seahawks, any team, it's tough. As we already mentioned with the NFC, that everyone's kind of got a quarterback right now, with the exception of a couple teams that at best maybe have a quarterback who is young and still trying to figure it out. And surely injuries will happen along the way too. But if you've got a quarterback like Russell Wilson, as we saw this year, because the Seahawks on offense had nothing else besides Russell Wilson for the most part, you've got a chance. They were one win, maybe one game, 1 week away from making the playoffs. It was very close to doing so, even though they had no help at running back and a porous offensive line once again. So we know that the Seahawks have a chance and that there are going to be opportunities for them to get better immediately and turn that around with Frank Clark, Jaron Reed, Bobby Wagner, KJ Wright, perhaps Earl Thomas, perhaps Richard Sherman. I think, Super Bowl, who knows at this point who any team is that's going to be a Super Bowl champion next year. The Eagles were 40-1 at this time, I think. So anything could happen between now and then, but at least I think I'd put the Seahawks in the top 12, top 10 of teams that could do it, but they've got bigger questions and they will be limited and restricted given the salary cap, given the free agents that they have, given their lack of second and third round picks. It's going to be tougher than usual for the Seahawks to reload like you're talking about. But in order to reload, they also have to decide which players they want to re-up. Their top 4 free agents right now in terms of starters would be Sheldon Richardson, Jimmy Graham, Luke Joeckel, and Paul Richardson. So, Rob, out of those 4 players, Paul and Sheldon Richardson, Luke Joeckel, Jimmy Graham, who do you prioritize, if any? How do they sort of make that work?
I think of all the players that are free agents, I think I'd probably prioritize the most is Bradley McDougald, just because I think that he proved that he could be quite a flexible player. No one would argue that he's as capable as Cam Chancellor or Earl Thomas, because he just isn't. But I think his ability to play either position and what he showed last year, and to give you that little bit of security, especially if this Earl Thomas potential move talk is legit, you're not going to want to change both positions. You're going to want somebody who's a little bit familiar. And I was sort of impressed with his play rather than impressed with his play. So I think there's a chance that he could be quite easily signed up. And with the rest, if Paul Richardson's going to get the kind of money that people are talking about and rumoring about, then I think that I would not be that interested in that one, because he's had one year really when he's been
healthy. In your head, or what figure do you have in your head that you've heard?
It seemed to be suggestions that he might get sort of Robert Woods money, around sort of $7-8 million a year, and I just feel like that seems a little bit rich for me for a player who's not been able to stay healthy for the bulk of his career so far and had injuries in college as well. Jimmy Graham, I don't think anybody should underestimate the touchdowns that he had, but I just think it's time to move on. You know, I just doesn't. It's never really fit with him here, and you know, even if you get him, I don't think he wants to be in Seattle. I don't think that he wants to be. I think he probably feels like he wasted 3 years of his career, you know, trying to be turned into something that he isn't, and probably wants to go somewhere now where he can catch touchdown passes and be Jimmy Graham instead of the complete tight end that Pete Carroll seemed to want to make him be. And as for Sheldon Richardson's the type of player that in an ideal world you would keep, but not at the kind of, you know, $14-15 million a year type value. So I think that the key with Richardson is probably going to be letting him test the market and establishing his value. So if his money is kind of where Dontari Poe's was a year ago, remember Poe didn't sign a long-term deal, he signed a 1-year deal with Atlanta. If his money's kind of in the $8 million for 1 year or 2 years kind of range, then you bring him back probably. Then you have a bit of an advantage there. And if teams are offering 12, 13, 14, $15 million, then you take the third round comp pick. That's kind of how I would view that one. Some other people have suggested that the one other alternative they could have is to franchise him and then see if you could get something on the open market. So essentially do what the Jets did a year ago. They knew they were going to lose him in a year, but they traded him to the Seahawks for essentially on a rental type deal. It may help the Seahawks get some draft stock now as opposed to in a year's time if they let him hit the market. So that's another option, but you also would be paying him $14 million a year, well, for 1 year if you were not able then to strike a trade, and it would be how comfortable are you paying him that for one season in 2018. He may be very hungry playing on that 1 year deal. He may feel like he has a point to prove after a somewhat statistically poor year in 2017, although he did have some good games. He may sort of feel that that's his sort of incentive there, but you know, it's still a lot of money for one player.
And I totally see what you're saying coming from with Bradley McDougald. Surely a guy that I think that they will prioritize early on. I was saving him maybe for the second tier. So good, but having already spoken on Bradley McDougald, some of that second tier free agents for the Seahawks, maybe Deshaun Shedd, who has not played on defense yet, but is healthy again. Marcus Smith, who had played in somewhat this season. Luke Wilson, who, they signed a 1 year deal last year. Those really round out the guys that I think they would consider or have to consider, as well as Ode Abushi, and I guess Dewey McDonald. I don't see them. Austin Davis, being a backup, Austin Davis being a free agent also means that the Seahawks will be looking once again for who's going to be their next guy in line at quarterback, whether it's a young project or a stable veteran. Maybe that's where a Teddy Bridgewater, someone of note or interest, could come into the headlines this March, perhaps. But in terms of that second tier with Deshaun Shedd, Byron Maxwell, Marcus Smith, Ode Abushi, Luke Wilson, anything there that strikes your fancy, or anything there, Michael Wilhite, Terrence Garvin, anything that makes you go, well, yeah, I think they got to get that guy back?
Well, I think the way that Byron Maxwell finished the year, it'd be very interesting to see him come back and just provide some extra depth at cornerback. And that way you're also covered if you wanted to. There has been some, Michael Silver was reporting that the Seahawks expected to move on without Richard Sherman next year when he did that piece after the Rams game. So if that is true and the Seahawks are essentially going to move Richard Sherman one way or another this offseason, then it's absolutely vital that you keep Byron Maxwell. Even if you keep Richard Sherman, then I would think that having Sherman and Maxwell and Griffin as sort of three who could start outside, and Coleman who could start inside at nickel, that would be it would be a situation worth having. If you can bring Deshaun Shedd back, then why not? Depending on his health situation and if you feel that he's made a full recovery. I think that apart from Maxwell, the biggest priorities for me would be to make sure that you sort out Dion Jordan, who's a restricted free agent, and Coleman, who's I think is also a restricted free agent as well. I think you have to keep those two. And then I think you just play it by ear with the rest and see what they get on the market. I think that Luke Wilson's going to have to do exactly what he did a year ago, which is go into free agency, see what offers he's being given, and then the Seahawks will probably offer him something, and it's whether or not he wants to stay in Seattle. And there may be some other teams that are offering him a few thousand more dollars, but he'll have to decide what he wants to do, whether he wants to move on, try a change of scenery, or whether he wants to stay in Seattle, which he seems to clearly like doing. So I think that's the situation with him. I think we're going to see a lot of moves, Kenny. I really do. I think this is going to be as big a change as some people like G. Scott recently was suggesting. I think we are going to see some major, major changes. I also think it's going to be with an eye towards the future. So I think that players may leave and the cap benefit this year might not be that significant, but the cap benefit in 2019 might be such that, you know, it's going to be a real benefit to the Seahawks. And it might be about accumulating some draft stock and trying to get younger and trying to do this all over again. I think that that's the way they're going to view this. And I think they'll also be somewhat active in free agency. I don't think they're going to be signing Andrew Norwell. I don't think they're going to be making some big splashes, but I could definitely think of 2 or 3 names that I can imagine them going after in free agency and possibly getting some value there as well, you know, on some maybe 1 or 2 year deals that they've done in the past and had some success with Bennett and Averill and McDougald. Obviously didn't work for Lacey and Jokel, but I could see them doing some of that again this year, and there's definitely sort of 2 or 3 names I could see them going after.
And let me use this opportunity then to transition into our third part of the show, which is we want to talk about the 2018 NFL draft. We want to talk about Seattle's needs as well as just what the fact of what's going to be out there. And one of the things that Seattle needs, and we saw this in heavy doses last season, is kicker. They signed Jason Myers, who, you know, became a free agent last year, formerly of the Jacksonville Jaguars. And the Seahawks certainly are parting ways with Blair Walsh after his one season. They kind of went the cheap route with Walsh, and they kind of folded their cards early when it came to a kicker search. They just said, well, we're going Blair Walsh. 1 year, $1 million. Buy Stephen Hauschka. That's it. We're good here. And let me ask you something, Rob, just from the standpoint of kicker finding solutions. We've seen teams draft kickers, and a lot of times it doesn't work out, whether it's early or late. Even the Eagles just won a Super Bowl with Jake Elliott, who was drafted last year, but he was drafted by the Cincinnati Bengals and then put on their, you know, and then cut, and the Eagles were able to swoop him off the practice squad. We rarely seem to see kickers drafted and then just take off. It's just kickers don't get drafted that often as is. That being said, kicker-wise, do you see benefit to drafting a kicker, or are you of the school to never draft a kicker? And how many draftable kickers do you see? Is there anyone of note, of special ability this year?
I think you would consider it. Certainly in rounds, probably more likely round 6 or 7 than any earlier than that. But if there was a kicker that you believed, I mean, let's just say that if Justin Tucker, for example, was part of this draft class, and you know, would you take him in the 6th or 7th round? Then yeah, you probably would. I wouldn't go any earlier than that. I mean, I would never spend a 2nd round pick like Tampa Bay did on a kicker. And as for the options this year, well, the bad news is that if there's anybody out there hoping there's a great kicker option for the Seahawks, then I'm afraid there really isn't. The one big name that people will be aware of is Daniel Carlson at Auburn, who scored a lot of points for Auburn. His long-range kicking's pretty good. He looks the part. You know, he's a big guy, very powerful kicker. As I mentioned, he had a very successful rate over 50 yards. But he's so inconsistent. He's maddeningly inconsistent in the short range. And you saw that at the Senior Bowl, where he missed a relatively straightforward kick. I think he missed an extra point as well. And then he nailed one from further out, which was, you know, that's who he is. And for me, you're not really making any step forward from Blair Walsh there. I mean, he to me is not somebody I would feel particularly confident putting the trust in next year to solve this problem. And it goes to show that if you find a kicker in the NFL, you've really got to cling on to them if they're a veteran. And it's a real shame that the Seahawks seemed to have their guy with Hauschka, and that he had his worst year right before he was about to be a free agent. I mean, if his contract had run out the year before, the Seahawks would have signed him to a longer-term deal. They would have probably lived through a difficult season, and they would have still had a fairly good kicker. Instead, they're now in this no man's land situation, which, you know, bad teams get themselves into this situation. And for me, I hope they do more than just stick with Jason Myers. I hope that they do look at some of the options out there, because when you look at who the free agent kickers are going to be, you've got people like Ryan Suckup, you've got Graham Gano, Vinatieri. It's probably unlikely that he's going to come to Seattle age 45. There are one or two others as well. Dustin Hopkins is a free agent. Kai Forbath, Janikowski was at Oakland, is a free agent. So I would hope that they would be able to find someone amongst that group who's capable of coming in and at least, for the very least, for 1 year, not being as inept as Blair Walsh was. But this is a draft where I think the options this is going to something I probably never said on a podcast with you before, Kenny. The options at punter are not that bad. They're there's a couple of decent punters in this draft by the looks of things, but kickers maybe not so. But if they're looking to move on from John Ryan, they may be able to draft a punter instead.
Well, don't tell very recent Seahawks Seaside Chats guest Sarah Colonna about any plans to move her husband, though this contract situation is looking dicey moving forward. With the draft, though, you've done something that not all mock drafters at this stage allow themselves to do, which is make some trades. And I think that's totally fair and fine and smart to do. And with that, you've done the thing that I think it also allows you to do the thing that I think the Seahawks will almost certainly do, which is trade down. And you have in your most recent mock draft, have the Seahawks trading down once with Atlanta and then twice with Cleveland, which pushes them out of the first round entirely. And I do want to talk first about the fact that I just read the most recent mock draft from Todd McShay, and I have yet to see, and these guys are being paid by ESPN. Look, I just lost my job at Sports on Earth because Sports on Earth doesn't exist anymore. So Sports on Earth is not paying me to do any mock drafts or not paying me to do this right now. But for God's damn sake, if someone paid me to do a mock draft, I would not have the Seahawks drafting a defensive back with the 18th overall pick. And I don't understand why anyone who has been doing this much longer than I have and with a lot more attention than I have would still have the Seahawks without really giving a good explanation, taking a cornerback or a safety in the first round. Maybe you could argue Derwin James. Maybe the cornerback that McShay had them taking. I don't even remember his name, but anyone that you put in there, it goes. At least tell me why you're going against all of Pete Carroll's and John Schneider's history. What are your thoughts on anyone or why the trend or why the need for people to mock a cornerback and ignore Seattle's their needs and B, their draft history?
Well, it's just quite frustrating, for Seahawks fans to read that stuff because, when you've had a 9-7 season and you're picking earlier than you have done since 2012, the mock drafts are a little bit more interesting this year. And nearly every single national mock draft that I see is that's the kind of the Mel Kiper, Todd McShay, Daniel Jeremiah, Lance Zierlein, Bucky Brooks type mock drafts. They all give the Seahawks a defensive back. It's either a cornerback or it's Derwin James. And as you correctly say there, Kenny, it wouldn't really take that much time and research. I mean, you'd pretty much just have to ask a Seahawks fan how likely that is, and they would be able to tell you it's highly unlikely. This is a team that has only ever spent one first-round pick on a defensive back, and that was Earl Thomas, and he's going to be a future Hall of Famer. The rest of their defensive backfield has been made up of, fifth-round picks like Richard Sherman and Cam Chancellor, or sixth-round picks like Byron Maxwell. It's undrafted free agents and guys that have come from the Canadian Football League like Brandon Browner. Pete Carroll clearly backs himself to coach up a certain body type of player and a certain physical profile. And they've never drafted a cornerback earlier because of that. And the only time they're ever going to draft a cornerback in the first round is if someone like Jalen Ramsey or Patrick Peterson is sat there and, you just have to take that kind of a guy. And even then, they may even, second guess that. They're not going to take a cornerback early. And I'm not convinced either they will take a safety early unless they really, like Earl Thomas, people maybe don't realize this. Earl Thomas had 8 interceptions in his final year at Texas. he wasn't just some guy who was, really fast and had range. He produced on the field. He was really, really good for Texas in that fight. Fantastic, fantastic player. It's unbelievable in hindsight that he lasted as long as he did to number 14 in the draft. Especially with Eric Berry going at number 5, you would think that Earl Thomas would go a lot earlier than he did. He lasted to number 14. It was a godsend for the Seahawks. And they're probably not going to take a safety either unless they're in that kind of caliber of quality there. They did find Cam Chancellor after all, with the day 3 pick. So I'm not too sure why this keeps happening, especially given that, the Seahawks' biggest needs are probably front 7 on the defense, because if Michael Bennett's moving on and Cliff Averill certainly seems like he's going to retire, then the pass rush is going to need some help. They could do with another linebacker. That's the front 7 on the defense. The offensive line, if there's a lot of good interior offensive linemen in this draft. Love Isaiah Wynn at Georgia, and I loved him for a while now. Billy Price, really good player at Ohio State. There are others that I can mention as well. So you can imagine them looking in that direction. And then it's a really great running back class. And again, you could pick one of those out to pair with the Seahawks. So they would seem like the more pressing needs to me than cornerback, and it does get a little bit frustrating because I look forward to the mock drafts like everybody else, at this time of year, and just to keep seeing Derwin James and cornerbacks listed with the Seahawks I just personally think James is more likely, but the cornerback certainly isn't likely.
So in the trading down scenario, one of the things that I wrote today about the Seahawks, and I think that they need and will focus on pass rush. When you look at the Philadelphia Eagles, one of the few things that does stand out about them is their 5 pass rushers who had 20 plus QB pressures. And the only other team that I think did that, I think was the Jacksonville Jaguars, and maybe one other team. And every team save for Washington that had at least 4 guys with 20 QB pressures made the playoffs and got to the divisional round. And 3 of those 6 teams were in the conference championships. And then, of course, you had the Eagles. Even New England, while they didn't have a star player on the defensive line and were led by Trey Flowers, at least had depth, unlike what Seattle has currently. And Seattle is facing a potential nightmare on their defensive line. Frank Clark has got 1 year left on his contract, and his next deal could be as big as Olivier Vernon's at $85 million, I think. Michael Bennett is 32 years old and already in trade talks and already sort of feeling how much more does he have to give? Cliff Averill perhaps will retire. Jaron Reed is a great run stopper, but not providing much in the pass rushing. But I do like him a lot and think he could get better. Naz Jones, same deal. But they need, Deion Jordan has played in 5 games in the last 4 years. We can't rely on him as an option as fans to necessarily come back. They need to add someone of note to the pass rush, I think. And when you talk about making moves and making a splash or something like that, I think it has to come from pass rushing standpoint. Sheldon Richardson, will he be coming back? We talked about it already. And one of the concerns that I had, at least if I'm the Seattle Seahawks or if I'm looking at the Seahawks, is the fact that there doesn't seem to be many edge rushers in this draft of note. And if there are, then we better pray for certain players at other positions to get pushed down. And even when the Seahawks trade down, it's going to make it unlikely for them to take a guy who has been rated as highly as, say, Brandon Graham or Fletcher Cox or Derek Barnett, all of whom were mid-first round picks by the Philadelphia Eagles. So, Rob, what are you seeing with the draft class in terms of pass rush? Could there be anyone at 18 that makes you go, got to stay here? And if the Seahawks were to trade down like you have them doing out of the first round to, say, pick 33, we saw them do that last year with Malik McDowell, and I didn't say it, but of course Malik McDowell, we don't know what his future will be. But do you see anyone in that early second, late first round that could be a high upside, good pick in terms of a pass rush?
Well, sadly, Kenny, you kind of summed it up well, because the edge rush options are not particularly great. It is a better draft class for interior rushers. Interior pass rushers seem to be quite a few of them in this class. So, for example, Bradley Chubb's going to go in the top 10. He's going to be possibly a top 5 pick, and then after that, I'm struggling to think. Marcus Davenport's probably going to go in the first round. I'm not sure that that's the kind of player to see. I mean, I like Marcus Davenport. He's got a lot of talent. He could end up being a really good player, but I just feel like where he's at the moment, he seems very young in his personality and a little bit. I don't want to say immature because that makes it sound like he's like a bad character or anything. He's not a bad character. He's just quite reserved and needs to come out of his shell a little bit. And I think he's going to take some time to become a man and to become a pro. And I'm not sure that's something the Seahawks really need to get involved in right now. He's going to be a project for somebody. But then, Arden Key's not. I don't think he's going to go in the first round. I think there's too much concern there. I'm not a big Sam Hubbard fan at Ohio State. And then you look at the rest of the options, and they're all interior guys. So like people like Tim Settle, Taven Bryan, Deron Payne, Vita Vea, Maurice Hurst, really good pass rusher, but he's a 3 technique. A lot of people like Harrison Phillips. I think he's probably going to go in the 3rd round, not the 1st, but he's there as well. Deshaun Hand's more of an inside-out type of guy. I don't see who the defensive end is going to be, who you would take early. Perhaps the only option would be someone like Harold Landry, for example, at Boston College. Now, Landry's really quick, could have a really good combine. He could be that sort of Bruce Irvin type that maybe Seattle has lacked, someone who can play as a Leo. But he does not play tough. He really doesn't. And he had a down year last year. Again, it's kind of like, what is a Seahawk right now? What are they going to be this is almost a rebuild for the team. What are they going to be looking for here? Are they going to start this with Harold Landry as their top pick? Maybe if he has a fantastic combine, but I'm really struggling to buy into that. So one of the things I've been thinking about in terms of how they're going to improve this pass rush is I think they'll re-sign Deion Jordan. So that's one player that's going to be in the mix. They're going to have Frank Clark. They may or may not have Michael Bennett. So maybe it's not absolutely death-defyingly, desperately needy. But one thing they have been able to do is they signed Bennett on the cheap. They signed Averill on the cheap. They traded for Chris Clemens. Is there somebody out there that they could bring in who's maybe a bit of a diamond in the rough? Is there somebody in free agency who they could get on a short-term deal in the same way they got Bennett and Averill to help them out a little bit? And who are the guys who could be available from round 3 onwards who might just have that, that bit of potential there to be something special or a contributor? And there are a few names if you want me to read some of those out. So, for example, you've got Kentavious Street at NC State, who could be an edge rusher for you, an inside-out type rusher, is said to have great athleticism. He's a bit unheralded, didn't have a great year, has got lots of potential, but didn't really put it together at NC State. Could be somebody they look at. You've got Tyquan Lewis, who tested quite well in the Nike Spark Combine, never really put it together at Ohio State, but I thought had a pretty decent Senior Bowl and has kind of got that ideal edge rush type of size that they like, can play inside and out, but can contain the rush. I thought that as a character, he's the type of player I could really see the Seahawks liking because he's a leader. He's going to come in there and he's going to be mature. He's played for Ohio State. They've competed every year that he's been there. So I think that Tyquan Lewis could be somebody who could provide some real value. You've got Josh Sweat at Florida State, who is an incredible athlete, could be a Leo, has had injury issues, but therefore might last a bit longer and could provide some real value. And he could be somebody who could be really good. You've got Duke Ejiofor, I think it's pronounced, at Wake Forest, and I was never particularly impressed with his tape. But he's long, he's big, he's tall, he's physical. Could be another player that they look at. And there are some interesting inside and out type guys as well. So you've got Chad Thomas at Miami. I really like the potential of Andrew Brown at Virginia. Was a highly recruited player, had a great Senior Bowl. Could be somebody who plays inside and out. And there are some good interior pass rushers too. So you've got people like Justin Jones at NC State, who I thought had a good combine, who they might consider too. So, there are options there. But unfortunately this year, if there are Seahawks fans who are hoping that there's this great defensive end prospect who'll be there at 18 or after a trade down, I'm afraid to say the answer is probably no. But there might be some diamonds from rounds 3 to 7 that you can bring in with a lot of upside, coach up, and could end up providing some real value for you.
Finally, a lot of people will be talking about the running back position and the future of that for the Seattle Seahawks. Last season, there was Chris Carson, Eddie Lacy, Thomas Rawls, Mike Davis, J.D. McKissick. They had to run through a bunch of guys. And I think next year, we know that Chris Carson's going to be back. We assume that, Thomas Rawls and Mike Davis could be back as restricted free agents. J.D. McKissick should be back. But you don't really get a sense, and CJ Prosise, who really knows at this point, but you don't really get a sense of what that order will be, or who, if any one of these guys is actually someone that you could be excited about. If Chris Carson is going to look like the Chris Carson that he looked like in the beginning of the season, or if he's going to look like the Thomas Rawls that we saw after Thomas Rawls suffered an injury during his breakout rookie season. So you couldn't really necessarily hedge your running back position on any one player. But as we've seen from the Philadelphia Eagles, who signed a LeGarrette Blount when nobody wanted LeGarrette Blount, even though he had 18 touchdowns the year before. When they traded for J.J. and gave up a 4th-round pick. When they used an undrafted free agent signee on Corey Clement. The New England Patriots, who pick up Deion Lewis from nowhere and sign him to a 2-year extension immediately that keeps him low cost, and Mike Gillisley, who's affordable. And there wasn't there hasn't been this emphasis in recent history of getting an elite running back and then having that elite running back take you to the Super Bowl. It doesn't seem to work that way. Ezekiel Elliott, what's his ceiling in terms of how much he can help the Dallas Cowboys get to the Super Bowl? Leonard Fournette, what's his ceiling? So it's interesting to see how big of a move did the Seahawks, need to make here, which is going to be the question. They made one of the biggest moves, believe it or not, to some people out there, maybe, that Eddie Lacy is a big move. You give a guy $4 million for 1 year to play running back. That's a big move in today's NFL. A lot of teams don't pay one running back that much, especially one who, was coming off of an injury in a 5-game season, and it clearly didn't work out. So the draft would seem to be a great place for them to start, though without 2nd and 3rd round picks. They'll have to see A, what their comp situation is like, and B, what the trade down is like, or C, Rob, as you suggested, perhaps there is an option at 18, a guy that you like a lot. So going over the running back situation, and you wrote this on Seahawks Draft Blog on Monday about the 2018 running backs in review and how you had 8 running backs in your top 50. So it's a very strong class at running back, headlined by Saquon Barkley at Penn State, and I don't think that we may never come to an agreement on whether or not you should draft a running back, even someone like Saquon Barkley in the top 5. But that being said, with Saquon Barkley, just for starters, you have him in the top 5. How would you compare him to Leonard Fournette a year ago, when we knew that Leonard Fournette was a transcendent generational running back?
I think he's better than Leonard Fournette. I think he's better than Zeke Elliott. I think he's better than Todd Gurley. Have I missed anybody out? I think he's better than all of those. I think he's got the size and the physicality of a typical power back, and he's kind of got the mobility, and he's just an incredible playmaker. And I know we obviously disagree very strongly on whether or not you should take a running back early. I think that my stance on it has always been, I kind of look at it 2 ways. Personally, I would never take an average player early, and I wouldn't take an average running back early. I think if you're going to pick in the top 5, you want a spectacular player, whatever position you're drafting, and a spectacular running back can still add a lot to a team. And I think that sometimes, as a NFL fan base, we get caught up in how far can this player get you? And unless we're talking about a quarterback, then often it doesn't really matter. A football team is a collection of parts that have to come together as one. And having a fantastic running back didn't the Seahawks. It was the heart and soul of the Seahawks during their Super Bowl runs. Having Marshawn Lynch was everything to the team. It was the beginning and the end, and he set the tone, not just for the offense but for the defense as well. And look what's happened since. They've gone from having the best running game in the league to the worst. So, that a running back can have an impact. Not every single one will, but it certainly can. And what's Zeke Elliott's ceiling? Well, Zeke Elliott had as much impact as anybody last year. And Dak Prescott was a rookie, and the fact that they could run the ball at will because of their offensive line and because of Zeke, which they couldn't do the year before when they didn't have Zeke, it just made such a difference. And it's not going to be that way for every team, of course. And, teams will draft running backs early. They will not succeed. People will criticize them. But then teams will draft running backs early, and they will end up being such an important force for their team, as obviously Todd Gurley is, I think, as Zeke is. And I think if someone like New York drafted Saquon Barkley, then they could be. And as for the Seahawks, it's hard to imagine, because we need to see what they're going to do. I mean, if they trade Earl Thomas and get another first-round pick, for example, it really opens up the draft for many different possibilities there. They could still trade down and get a running back. They could take a running back and then trade down and address another position. There are so many options that they could do there. If they stay at 18, I think the only player they would probably consider there is Ronald Jones, because I think that he's going to be Jamal Charles 2.0. I think that he's a special talent. I think that Ronald Jones, the players that excite me most that are realistic for the Seahawks are Ronald Jones the second, Isaiah Wynn, the Georgia player, and Billy Price at Ohio State. They're the three that excite me the most. And I wouldn't be disappointed if they stuck and just drafted any of those. I think they'd all be a benefit to the running game. If they move down, they might not be able to get Ronald Jones, and then it brings others into play. I mean, I've got so many thoughts, Kenny, about what they might do at running back. I mean, there's like a million things I've considered over the last 2 or 3 weeks. But if you want to ask questions about individual players, I'm happy to do that.
What do you come back to? Because I'm even like thinking with Saquon Barkley, it's not so much what the ceiling of the high drafted player can do, so much as how much better is that player than the ones that you're getting in the second round or in free agency or in third round. Le'Veon Bell, second rounder. LaShawn McCoy, second rounder. Jordan Howard, fourth rounder. Kareem Hunt, third rounder. All of these players who have had huge impact. Mark Ingram, even as a late first round pick, has worked out pretty well. And he, of course, was paired with Alvin Kamara, who was a third round pick. Marshawn Lynch, even 2 mid-round picks in a trade for the Seattle Seahawks, not the 12th overall selection of Buffalo Bills. It's just there are so many guys out there who are available, and teams don't value running backs very much, to the point where it's tough to put a huge stock to me into a thing where you could say, well, you could have Saquon Barkley and there's the use of your number 2 pick, or you could have Doug Martin and Bradley Chubb, or you could have, DeMarco Murray, who will probably be released, and Bradley Chubb. It feels to me that there are options. So if the Seahawks, and it seems to me like in this year's class especially, and it sucks for the Seahawks until they trade down, but it seems like the second and third round is going to be a great place for running backs this season, especially. Would you say that day 2 is going to be a good day for running backs? Yeah. And who would you like the most?
It's going to be a fantastic day for running back. The counter that I always have for that, though, is that you could pretty much make that same argument that you just made about running backs for pretty much any position. So to run through, everybody would agree, anybody who follows football would agree that the quarterback position is the most important position. It's undisputed. And yet you run down the list of teams in the NFL right now. The Patriots have had the most glorious run under a 6th round quarterback. The Bills made the playoffs for the first time in a generation with Tyrod Taylor, who they signed off the street as their quarterback. The Chiefs got off to a flying start, made the postseason with Alex Smith, who they traded for a 2nd round pick. The Raiders had Derek Carr, who was a 2nd round pick.
What would be easier for the Seahawks right now to do?
Just to this point off, though. Just to finish this point off, because I think it is important. The Eagles lost their quarterback, who they drafted 2nd overall, and brought in a backup who won them the Super Bowl, who was again off the streets. The Cowboys have a 4th round quarterback in Dak Prescott. The Seahawks have a 3rd round Super Bowl winning quarterback. The 49ers went to a Super Bowl with Kaepernick, who was a 2nd round. The Vikings lost their 2 quarterbacks and had Case Keenum win from the street. I mean, these are the things that I would say, is that, you say, well, what's the most important thing? What's the most important? the most important thing is good players. You know, this is what you need in the NFL. And like, all I think you can do is like, okay, let's grade Saquon Barkley. Let's run through everything he does well in the same process that we do with every other running back. And let's give him a score at the end. Let's give him a grade. And then let's compare him to the others. And Saquon Barkley is going to get a grade that matches the kind of grades that, for example, just to throw a name out there, Andrew Luck or John Elway would have got when they were entering the league. He's going to be pretty much as close to perfect as you're going to get. And that, for me, that means you have to consider taking him early, because he might be, for example, just to use the NFL.com method of grading, I think he's down as like a 7.8 or something like that. And then the next best running back is like a 6.4. And then you've got a lot who are like 6.2, 5.8, 5.6. He's that much better. And, you know, you have a chance to draft a superstar there. And he might not win you a Super Bowl. He might not. He might not be the thing that ultimately is the deciding factor. But he's got Hall of Fame potential. And when you have players like that, it's very difficult not to make a case to draft them early.
I mean, if they're just, you know, it's not in terms of the whole position, you know, there has to be a difference between any position and any other position. They're all relative to one another, and no one's disputing that the quarterback is the most important. And I don't think that you would dispute that it is also the hardest to find, because if it wasn't hard to find in terms of what we're laying out as the groundwork or the basis, first of all, the Eagles would not have won the Super Bowl without Carson Wentz, and I think we both can agree on that. There was no way that they were going to get at the number 1 seed with Nick Foles. And so, like, but in general, just if you are a team, and we know this because we've talked about it for however many years we've been doing this podcast, and we've talked a lot about the offensive line, and we've talked about the problems of a tackle. And I've laid out, you know, in an article recently, how many premier tackles are drafted outside of the top 10, and it's pretty fucking hard to do. So if you're the Seahawks, or if you're any team and you want a left tackle, you know that they are hardly ever going to become free agents, and they're almost never going to fall out of the top 10, and you may get lucky, and you may find, of course, we're going to find exceptions like a Jason Peters. Of course, we're going to find exceptions. We're going to find those rare guys that fall out of the top 10, but we know that there's a premium on tackles. We know there's a premium on edge rushers. It's hard to find those things. They cost $90 million. A running back costs $6 million. A running back goes in the second round. If the Seahawks want to get a running back, which they have to do this year, I am very confident that they'll be able to do that. If the Seahawks want to get a left tackle, they had to trade their second round pick and then some to acquire Dwayne Brown, and he's old and he costs a lot of money and he's a free agent in a year. So it's not as nearly ideal as if the Seahawks wanted Le'Veon Bell, who, you know, maybe they could go and get a guy like that this year if they literally wanted to do that. It would be possible to do, because I think even Le'Veon Bell is going to spend at least a couple days on the free agent market if the Steelers don't come to some, you know, hometown agreement with him before then. So the problem to me is just like running back, the league itself has taken the value out of the position. The league itself has dictated that the best free agent running back, like LeGarrette Blount, or if it's going to be DeMarco Murray a couple years before that, or whatever it is going to be out there on the market for quite a while. It's going to get uncomfortable, and no one's going to sign him to a long-term contract. Le'Veon Bell, a Hall of Fame caliber running back in today's era, only got the franchise tag, and then the Steelers, he put 400 plus touches on him, just like the Cowboys did 4 years earlier with DeMarco Murray, because they don't have any intention probably to bring him back. And they said, we're going to utilize you as much as we can. And that's just a theory I have, of course, but it rang true for DeMarco Murray, and then DeMarco Murray collapsed under the weight of 400 touches in a new scheme. So I think that there's so much that goes into, you know, protecting the running back position, getting the most out of a running back, having an offensive line that's even going to give a running back an opportunity. You know, Saquon Barkley or whoever it is, it's just, to me, there's so many resources that to use a top 5 pick where you can get an edge rusher, and that might be your only opportunity to get an edge rusher. Look at Washington. Look, if you go back to the 2010 draft and the Seahawks got Russell Okung immediately, There was no if they knew that they were going to get better, they knew that this was their chance to get a tackle. And Washington took Trent Williams that year, 2 picks earlier, and it Tyron Smith, 9th overall. There was just certain positions that you certainly can't get away from in the top 10. Quarterback, tackle, and edge rusher have to take significant priority over running back, even if he's the best player in the draft, even if you think that he's going to be a Hall of Famer, to be honest.
Right. Well, let me just sort of counter that then. So, I don't. If you were trying to pick between, if you had, for example, an offensive tackle, left tackle, a defensive end, and a running back with the same grade, and you had needs at all 3 positions, I think that you could certainly build a very, very strong case to not draft the running back in that position. I think the thing with Saquon Barkley is we have to remember it. There's not going to be a left tackle, for example, who is worthy of possibly even a top 10 pick, let alone a top 5 pick. And there's probably only going to be one edge rusher, and that is Bradley Chubb. And I'm a huge Bradley Chubb fan. But is Bradley Chubb a home run kind of pick compared to Saquon Barkley? Not necessarily. Now, there will be teams who would take Bradley ahead of Saquon because of the reasons you've said there. But I would also say this is why I think you can build a case for anything else, and why you have to judge I would never say never draft a player, never draft a certain position. I would always say judge every case on its merit. Who's in the draft class? What are your needs? What kind of players are out there? So that you don't force yourself from a philosophy to ignore a potentially great player because you've made your mind up before you've even judged the class. And you can make arguments. For example, the total sack leaders in the NFL last season, and I know that sacks are not everything, but just to sort of prove the point, Chandler Jones, Arizona led the league. He cost Arizona a 2nd-round pick. Calais Campbell was a free agent, was formerly a 2nd-round pick. DeMarcus Lawrence was a 2nd-round pick in Dallas. Everson Griffin was a 4th-round pick in Minnesota. Cam Jordan was the number 23 pick. Ryan Kerrigan was a mid-1st-round pick. They're the top 6 sack leaders in the NFL this year. None of them were a top 15 pick, I don't think. Kerrigan maybe. The others were not. And only one of the others, other than Kerrigan and Jordan, was a 1st-rounder. So you can always find talent in a draft. That's the skill of drafting. It's what the Seahawks did so well initially. And in free agency as well, I'm finding people like Bennett and Avron, Clemens and whatnot. And I think when it comes to the draft, you've always got to have stances on if players are graded similar, which positions win out and stuff like that. But I think in the case of Saquon, I would say that unless you're one of the teams that desperately needs a quarterback and would have no complaints from me if for example, Sam Darnold, Josh Rosen, Josh Allen, and Baker Mayfield were the first 4 picks because quarterback need wins, and it always will. But as soon as you start getting onto the teams that don't need quarterbacks, I think you're going to make a very difficult case to argue against them drafting Saquon. So I just think he's that good. And I think in 10 years' time, we may well be talking about him being the best player in the NFL.
Would you draft? I mean,
people not take that.
You did say earlier that you wouldn't draft a kicker in the first 2 rounds, right?
Oh, yeah. I wouldn't. Yeah,
would you draft a center in the top 5?
Possibly.
I don't think that like we already set out this already saying that we weren't going to agree. But that's fine. But I think there's a lot of people on both sides of the argument. And I think both sides have things that make a lot of sense. In terms of the Seahawks though, with their running back situation, so just how highly of do you think that they're placing running back? Do you think it could be their first pick? And if they don't get out of day 1 and day 2 with a running back, what happens on day 3?
I think it could be a priority for them. Again, it really depends what they do. I honestly think, Kenny, what they'll do is they'll sign a free agent running back as a hedge, and then they will let the draft sort of come to them. So I could imagine them signing Carlos Hyde, for example, in San Francisco and saying, okay, well, at the very least, we've addressed the position, and then sort of letting the situation play to them. So if they can trade down and get some stock, then you see how the board's moving. And then if you've got the running back already in place, then maybe you consider someone like Billy Price who could play guard, or Isaiah Wynn, or one of the defensive front seven players, depending on who's there. And then if you look in the second round, you could still find your running backs, or even in the third round. But I do think that there are players that they will also consider early. So I think that Ronald Jones have talked about that. I think in round 2, you're talking about Nick Chubb, you're talking about Darius Geis, you're talking about Sony Michel. I don't think Royce Freeman's their type of running back, but I expect him to go in that range. Rashad Penny. And I think, so just to talk about a couple of the players, I think that Geis is a funny one, because I think Geis's personality and his attitude and his running style all remind me of Thomas Rawls. And they clearly loved what Thomas Rawls brought to the table. It's just that he just completely fell apart as a player the last couple of years. So if they liked Rawls, they may well like Geis, but he's not a very good athlete. So you just wonder sort of where he's going to go. But there'll come a point in the draft when he's really good value. And I just wonder if the Seahawks did trade down rather dramatically or acquired sort of like a late second round pick. If he was still there, they might feel that's an absolute bargain for a physical, tough, impactful runner. So that could be one option for them. Nick Chubb's an explosive athlete, and he's kind of just getting back to his best and his best physical shape, having had the bad knee injury, and is somebody that could be like a Jonathan Stewart type for them. But there is just something special about Ronald Jones that I just keep going back to, which Jamal Charles was such a fantastic player and such an incredible superstar running back that I think if they had a chance to get Carlos Hyde, and whether they draft Ronald Jones at 18, 25, 35, 45, whenever he's going to be available, if you had a chance to sort of put Hyde and Carson and Jones as your backfield next year, and you're able to do some things on defense later in the draft, I think that the Seahawks would be in a good position. I think that they would be competitive. I think that they're not going to get rid of everybody, so I think that would be a pretty attractive position to be in.
And just to go over some of the potential free agents, you mentioned Carlos Hyde, just so people out there maybe have some names on the mind. I mentioned Le'Veon Bell, and I'm picking out players maybe that are either have starting experience or, could have starting experience and maybe don't have, or maybe not leaving. I'm kind of leaving out like Darren Sproles, who has his specialty. So it's like Le'Veon Bell, Frank Gore, who, is getting older, Isaiah Crowell, Terrence West, Alfred Morris, Dion Lewis, LeGarrette Blount, Jeremy Hill, Carlos Hyde, Andre Ellington, CJ Spiller, but again, that's a former Seahawk there. Charles Sims, Stephen Ridley, and Christine Michael technically is coming out there again. But there's not a lot there. And then Over the Cap lays out some potential cuts at running back: Doug Martin, Chris Ivory, Matt Forte, Mike Gillisley, Adrian Peterson, Charkandrick West, and DeMarco Murray. Anyone on those potential cuts that you think could be a fit for Seattle?
I think the free agents that I would expect them to go after are mostly going to be on offense, I think. They'll look for value on defense. So if any of the pass rushers don't get a lot of money, I think they'll go that. I think that Eric Reed could be an option for them. I think that, a lot of people talk about Derwin James as an option in the draft. Well, Eric Reed is essentially Derwin James. They're very similar physically and in size and everything. So I could imagine them signing Eric Reed possibly to a short-term 1 or 2 year deal. His involvement in the protests will possibly put some teams off, but it won't put the Seahawks off. So, there may be some value to be had there. I could see them going after Carlos Hyde for a similar way. He's older than people realize. I think he's 28 already. He's not had a 1,000-yard season. He has been banged up a little bit, and his value might be a little bit low. I mean, there's a reason why San Francisco is going to possibly let him hit the market. So his value might be a lot lower than people realize. You might actually be able to get Reed and Hyde on pretty team favorable deals. And then what I think they're going to do is I think they will possibly look at the wide receiver position, which they're going to have to add to at some point. I mean, they only really have Doug Baldwin and Tyler Lockett there. I mean, Amara Darboh didn't show anything as a rookie, so it's hard to be sort of really optimistic about what he's going to do. And it's a really strong-looking group of receivers who might be available. So you've got Sammy Watkins, Jarvis Landry, Allen Robinson, Marquise Lee, Terrell Pryor, and there are others that you can mention as well. Last year, Alshon Jeffrey had to sign a 1 year deal, and Terrell Pryor had to sign a 1 year deal to try and prove themselves again at different teams. And I just wonder if maybe someone like Watkins or Robinson or Marquise Lee or Terrell Pryor again are going to have to do the same this time. and whether there's going to be some value at the receiver position too. You know, where they don't have to make a long-term commitment, they can just bring some guys in on reasonable contracts and give them a year to show what they can do in the offense. And you know, that would make, they're going to have to find some touchdowns as well. So, you know, that's another thing. They're going to have to find receivers, tight ends, Austin Severian Jenkins. Maybe they take a punt on Tyler Eifert on a really short-term, cheap-ish deal because he's not been able to stay healthy, and they just try and seek some value. You know, kind of how they did, and just churn this thing and just keep churning until they find the next core group of this team. I think that's what they're going to have to do from now on to get back to the top, and that's kind of what I think they're going to do. But I think Hyde, Reed, one of the receivers, one of the tight ends, I think that's pretty much a safe bet for the kind of plan they were going to do. And by the way, Kenny, have you seen this breaking news involving the Colts?
What is it?
Josh McDaniels has turned down the chance to coach them at the 11th hour.
Wow.
So he's going to go back to New England, and now everybody's speculating whether this means that Belichick's going to retire or not. But I've also seen a report suggesting that Belichick will be back in 2018, but it certainly seems like Josh McDaniels has turned down the Colts to return to New England to become their head coach in the future, possibly maybe even as soon as 2019.
That's interesting, you know, and we didn't get to the new head coaches on this episode. I'd been thinking about it and did a lot of just sort of wormholing and doing a lot of research on the new head coaches and thinking about their fits. And Josh McDaniels, I know, had been linked to Indianapolis as much as 2 years ago when there was talk about should we fire Chuck Pagano and hire Josh McDaniels or Matt Patricia. They were looking at, I think, either one. And, you know, Josh McDaniels was a guy who was hated in Denver and very successful in New England, you know, the number one offense in total since he returned there 6 years ago or whatever. But it's interesting to think about what that says about Jim Irsay and the Indianapolis Colts and Andrew Luck and the future of things there. And as well as where do they turn now for the Colts and Andrew Luck. And, oh, man, just to think about the path and the fork in the road that Andrew Luck and Russell Wilson have had over the last 2-3 years after the debate was so hotly contested in which was a better quarterback in 2012. And I think that it just sort of, even though Russell Wilson, some people still don't really like him in terms of a football player. He still led the NFL in touchdowns last year. And do you think this says anything as well about Andrew Luck and the sort of the future for Indianapolis, or is this just an opportunity that he sees that he prefers in New England? Because it's interesting to even think that you would prefer a situation in New England. They have no current future quarterback, and the Patriots' success. We've seen that the Packers and the Cowboys and the 49ers, hey, plenty of dynasty franchises end up going in the tank for a very long time. Do you think this is even a smart decision?
I think I've got quite a few thoughts. I'll try and make them really quick, Kenny, for you. First of all, the NFL has to do something about the rule situation with the coaching thing. So the Colts clearly felt like they had McDaniels tied up, you know, a few weeks ago. Otherwise, why would they stop interviewing candidates? So he must have, at some point, you know, in the sort of the background negotiations that they do with agents, or whatever, that's not technically allowed but happens, he must have given them some indication that he was going to be their next head coach, because it was just assumed that he was going to be it. They've actually announced, the team tweeted out and have announced via a press release that Josh McDaniels was the new head coach. And he's turned his back on that after the announcement's been made. I mean, how is it allowed that, you know, that this kind of situation can happen? Teams really need to be able to go on a point. So he should, if the Colts wanted to make McDaniels their head coach, they should have been allowed to announce that he was going to be their head coach and sign a contract before the Super Bowl and stuff like that. Because now they're left completely in the lurch. You know, they've got to go out and find somebody else now, having already announced McDaniels as the coach. So that's one thing, that they've got to change the rules there. The second thing is, I think McDaniels probably sees this as, well, next year he will have an opportunity to win he's got a better chance to win a Super Bowl ring as the offensive coordinator in New England, or maybe even the next couple of years, depending on how long Belichick coaches for. He's got better opportunities to win more Super Bowl rings with Tom Brady than he has trying to launch a rebuild in Indianapolis. And then if Belichick moves on, he's got a better chance if Brady's still there to win Super Bowls as a head coach. And ultimately, I think that's what's driving him on. But I hope he's made the right decision here because, for his sake anyway, not for anybody else's, but no other NFL team is ever going to offer him a head coaching job now after this. So, and I'm not quite sure why the Patriots, having known he was going to become the Colts coach, didn't do this sooner so that the Colts could have cracked on, unless they've deliberately done this to kind of screw an AFC opponent.
They were also, I believe that Josh McDaniels was linked to Darrell Bevell, and what I read this morning. So Darrell Bevell, I mean, is still available, and the only other guy, according to this article that I'm seeing, that is still available is Chris Richard. So they've interviewed. They interviewed Matt Nagy, who went to the Bears. They interviewed Mike Vrabel, who went to the Titans. They interviewed Steve Wilkes, who went to the Cardinals. They interviewed Matt Rule, the head coach at Baylor, who said he was staying at Baylor. And they interviewed Chris Richard, who took a job with the Cowboys, but I would assume that the Cowboys would let him out if he had the opportunity to head coach the Colts. So, I mean, it seems like maybe even Chris Richard and Darrell Bevell could be candidates for the job, right?
Possibly so.
How interesting would it be for them to get that job after essentially being fired by the Seahawks that same year, but all because the Colts assumed that they had found their guy up until this very moment?
Well, it's going to be hard for whoever takes over because the Colts announced that Josh McDaniels was their head coach. I mean, it was announced. So whoever comes in knows they're going to be,
right,
second choice. They're going to come in and what does it say for the Colts? I mean, they're a team that are just not that long ago were in the AFC Championship and had Andrew Luck and were seemingly moving in the right direction, and then the arse has just completely fallen out of it. I mean, the GM was clearly incapable. They've finally got rid of the coach Pagano, who probably needed to go sooner than he did. Now they seem to have got a fairly competent GM, and I guess just whatever. I don't know. Maybe teams are scared off by Andrew Luck's injury and feel like this is an enormous rebuild with the potential to have to move on from Andrew Luck, which I don't think anybody in Indianapolis was thinking of doing 3 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And now that might be a reality. So if you're a Colts fan right now, you're pretty depressed, I imagine.
Well, interesting final news there coming out of Indianapolis and New England. Already I'm seeing stuff about, of course, did the Patriots just cheat some more? But yeah, and so that's interesting, and we'll see what happens there. Rob, that's it for this week of 3000 NFL Mock Draft. If you were going to leave the listeners out there with maybe a tape to study, what would be your tape study of the week, a player to go out and watch more of in preparation for this upcoming draft?
Wow, that's a great question. So do you want sort of an earlier round guy, or do you want someone for later on?
Whichever one, you feel makes the most sense, or maybe both.
Okay, well, I'll give you a couple of names for both. So if you want to look at later round guys, I would the guy I talked about a little bit earlier, Andrew Brown at Virginia. Go and see if you can find some stuff from him from the Senior Bowl. Go and see if you can find some tape on him on YouTube as well, because I think that he's a player who's never really put it all together at Virginia. Was a highly recruited player, but has definitely got some talent there. Kind of in a similar boat to Deshaun Hand, somebody who maybe needs the right kind of guidance to get to tap into his potential. Another sort of later round guy could be someone like Durham Smythe, who was the tight end at Notre Dame. I think the Seahawks, if they do draft a tight end, it is going to be a wide tight end, and that's very much what he is. Good blocker, does make some plays in the passing game, seems like a really good character, and seems like the kind of tight end they might, I can imagine them drafting. So go and have a look at Durham Smythe, the tight end from Notre Dame. Marquise Haynes at Ole Miss is another guy you may want to go and check out there as well. Tyquan Lewis I mentioned earlier. And Jeff Holland at Auburn. So there's a load of names for you there. And if you want sort of earlier round guys, then if you haven't checked him out already, then go and have a look at Isaiah Wynn. Because if you like really good offensive line play, then you will love Isaiah Wynn. He's just a fantastic player. One of my favorites in the draft. Absolutely fantastic talent, Isaiah Wynn. One of the best players in the draft class. And then You know, again, if two other players, Tim Settle, still very, very underrated, a defensive tackle at Virginia Tech, incredibly underrated player. Go and have a look at his tape at Virginia Tech there. There's plenty of highlights and stuff online now. And the running back that I've talked about, Ronald Jones II. If you get a chance, I did a blog post on this a few weeks ago. If you get a chance to watch his college tape, and then you immediately watch Jamal Charles's college tape at Texas, I personally felt like I was watching the same player. So if you want to do that exercise, you can either dig out the blog post and put the two videos together, or you can just do it yourself on YouTube. I think you'll be impressed with what you see.
There you go. We'll make that a recurring segment. Rob's tape study homework of the week. You heard it there. And for more, go to SeahawksDraftBlog.com or FieldGoals.com. Hey, go to both. Follow us on Twitter at FieldGoals. Me, I'm Kenneth Arthur S. Rob Staten at Rob Staten, Staton. This has been 3000 NFL Mock Draft. If you want to subscribe on iTunes, do so by going to Seaside Chats with Kenneth Arthur. One of these days, I'll figure out how to make this make sense and streamline everything. But for now, do that. And we'll come back pretty soon here to talk about some more things regarding the Seahawks and the draft. And that's it for this week. Congratulations, to the Eagles. And I guess congratulations to Josh McDaniels, the Colts. I think they both sort of win this one. So that's it for this week on 3000 NFL Mock Draft. Come back next time for a brand new draft.